Okay, let's dive right into a really fascinating language puzzle. Have you ever wondered how different cultures engineer the exact same human thoughts, but using completely different structural blueprints? Well, today we're dissecting English and Uzbek. We're going to explore how English relies so heavily on front-loaded prepositions, while Uzbek uses this genuinely ingenious system of cases and postpositions, basically tacked onto the end of words, to do the exact same job. To get our heads around this, we're going to follow a pretty clear roadmap. We'll quickly cover the grammatical architecture of these languages, SVO versus SOV structures, how prepositions compare to cases, when exactly to use postpositions, some practical translation examples, and finally, why mastering comparative grammar actually matters in the real world. All right, Section 1, Grammatical Architecture of Languages. We're kicking things off by looking at the broad strokes. Think about how a language indicates the relationship between words. Like when you say you're going to the store or looking under the table. How a language builds those connections depends entirely on its foundational base architecture. So the core difference between our two systems really comes down to how they build meaning. English is an analytic language. Think of it as placing separate, independent wooden blocks next to each other to build a sentence. Uzbek, on the other hand, is an agglutinative language. Instead of loose blocks, it's a lot more like snapping Lego pieces directly onto a main base block. It literally glues functional suffixes straight onto the root word to convey that exact same meaning. Moving right along to Section 2, SVO versus SOV structure. Let's see how this base architecture dictates the big picture of exactly where these relational words have to sit in a sentence. English follows an SVO, subject, verb, object. You just say, I eat apples. But Uzbek follows an SOV, subject, object, verb structure. The thought is organized as, I apples eat. The action is anchored at the very end of the sentence. Honestly, if you've ever heard Yoda speak in Star Wars, you kind of already have an intuitive feel for SOV architecture. It fundamentally changes how you process incoming information. And this architectural shift, it absolutely dictates relational word placement. Because English is SVO, its relational words, prepositions, sit before the noun. Pre literally means before. But because the verb anchors the end of an Uzbek SOV sentence, its relational words must follow the noun. They're post-positioned. It's just a brilliant, entirely logical consequence of where the verb lives. Which brings us to Section 3, Prepositions versus Cases. Now that we know the architecture, how do we actually map English's independent helper words against Uzbek's glued-on suffixes? The ones formerly known as cases or kelishiklar in Uzbek? Look at the mechanics of direction here. In English, the preposition to sits completely independently, right before the destination noun, to Moscow. But in Uzbek, that direction is handled by the dative case suffix, ga, and it's glued right onto the end of the word, creating Moskva. The concept is identical, right? But the structural delivery is completely flipped. And we see the exact same logic applied to location. The English preposition in transforms beautifully into the Uzbek locative case, da. It snaps onto the base noun just like that Lego piece we were talking about earlier, giving us Moskvada. The English analytic block seamlessly becomes an Uzbek agglutinative suffix. But wait, this brings up a huge pivot point, and it's honestly something a lot of language learners struggle with. What happens when the relationship we want to express is simply too complex, too abstract, or just too lexically heavy for a basic case suffix to handle? Like, do all prepositions just become little glued-on suffixes? No way. Section 4. When are postpositions used? This is where we answer a really critical comparative question.
Kelişik binen kumakçı kanday kıyaslanadı.
How exactly do we compare cases and postpositions when a simple glued-on suffix just isn't cutting it? Enter the Uzbek postposition, or komakçı. Here is the real core difference. A case, a kelişik, is just a tiny bound suffix handling basic spatial concepts, stuff like in, on, to, or from. But a postposition, a komakçı, is a fully separate, independent word. It steps up to handle the heavier, abstract concepts like about, despite, or through. But here's the kicker. Staying perfectly true to its SOV roots, Uzbek still places these independent postposition words after the noun. So when we map out these heavier English prepositions, words like about, above, after, or against, they don't translate to small case suffixes. Instead, they find their exact Uzbek counterparts in independent postpositions, like hakida for about, or ustida for above. The language needs more semantic weight, right? So it uses a full word rather than just a glued-on ending. Mapping this out structurally, you can see the precise logic at play here. Expressing simple ideas like to or from requires snapping on a suffix. Expressing deeper, abstract ideas like about or above requires a separate postposition word. But the golden rule? In both instances, the marker always comes after the root word. All right, Section 5, Translation and Practical Examples. Let's look at how a bilingual speaker or a dedicated language student applies this comparative knowledge fluidly in real time. How do we take all this theory and put it directly into practice? While this mental three-step process is literally the exact framework a bilingual speaker uses. First, you spot the English preposition. Next, you evaluate its weight. Is it basic direction, or is it something more abstract? And finally, based on that evaluation, you dynamically switch from the analytic English mindset to the agglutinative Uzbek mindset, deploying either a suffix or a postposition at the end of the noun. Finally, Section 6, the importance of comparative grammar. Let's synthesize everything we've looked at today and talk about why mastering this specific structural divide, this precise mapping of prepositions to cases and postpositions, is absolutely crucial. Because understanding this fundamental shift, it doesn't just teach you grammar rules to cram for a test. It essentially prevents those clunky word-for-word translation errors where a beginner tries to awkwardly force an English preposition into the beginning of an Uzbek sentence. By deeply understanding the why behind the where, you fundamentally upgrade your ability to process and produce human language across entirely different linguistic families. It's a real game changer. So I'm going to leave you with this really provocative thought to ponder. Because when you realize that English speakers arrange their world with separate blocks pointing forward, while Uzbek speakers build their world by layering concepts backwards onto a solid foundation, you realize something profound. Exploring comparative grammar always reveals just as much about the incredible flexibility of the human mind as it does about the words we speak.